Hello, good morning. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Saturday, November 8th, 2025. The time is 11:17 p.m., and I am in downtown Miami, Florida. The topic of today's lecture is the invisible empire. Now, those of you who are familiar with history, particularly American history, may know that the invisible empire was a euphemism that was used for the Ku Klux Klan. I am not using the term invisible empire as a reference to the Ku Klux Klan. I have mentioned in previous videos that the Ku Klux Klan were one of the primary subjects of the FBI's COINTELPRO program that ran in the 1960s that sought to disrupt the activities of the new Ku Klux Klan, the Black Panther Party, and the American Communist Party, all of which the federal establishment of the United States saw as subversive to government and deleterious to society. So, COINTELPRO, Operation Hoodwink, which is a program that I oftentimes describe as the spiritual progenitor to gang stalking, meaning its predecessor, has roots in the disruption of political dissidents. And the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Panther Party, and the American Communist Party of the 1960s were all disrupted internally and externally by COINTELPRO Operation Hoodwink. Now, the FBI discontinued COINTELPRO Operation Hoodwink, but its blueprint survived. And down through the years, this program, which essentially is a signaling protocol in which strategically planted liaisons in various parts of the United States are given their orders from the intelligence community of the United States, particularly with respect to the mobilization of people towards a specific target, towards a specific objective, towards a specific end. And the end game of COINTELPRO was to disrupt the members of the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Panther Party, and the American Communist Party so that those programs could no longer operate, so that those institutions, those groups, those fraternities, those political entities could no longer operate. And the members of those political dissident groups were essentially dismantled as functioning members of society, and eventually they had to disband those groups. And the disruptors were various U.S. citizens themselves that were used in undercover capacities, in particularly capacities that required the personal or professional dismantling of the members of these groups inside their homes, outside their homes, various surveillance and electronic surveillance mechanisms. There were a number of mechanisms that included the interception of mail, the denial of benefits, harassment by various persons, attacks by various persons. Some of these people's homes were burned down. Some of their cars were blown up. Some of their family members and friends were kidnapped. A number of the members were killed. It was essentially an all-out urban war, okay, that the federal establishment waged against these political dissident groups, leading into their eventual collapse as viable political entities. So, what we have is a situation now where this program, COINTELPRO, it was modified, it was restructured, it was transformed and metamorphosized into something more. All right? You no longer have to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Panther Party, or the American Communist Party to experience the kind of disruption mechanisms that COINTELPRO, Operation Hoodwink, brought to its subjects. You could simply be somebody who made the wrong enemy. You could simply be somebody who's too outspoken. You could simply be somebody that was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or said the wrong thing to the wrong person, or perhaps a number of people who were plugged into clandestine gang stalking created a false narrative about you as to why you ought to be entered into this human behavior modification, human behavior experimentation, social engineering, organized disruption, and attack protocol. Doesn't matter what your profession is. You could be a teacher, you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could be an oil mechanic. It doesn't matter. If you get referred by the right person to the right people, you can wind up in a clandestine gang stalking campaign just as easy as you'd go into the store and buy a pack of bubble gum. All right, I'm talking in the snap of a finger. There you are. And take it from me, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, that this program has roots in COINTELPRO. It is the invisible empire. Not necessarily the same invisible empire that the Ku Klux Klan ran in the 1920s. But it's a more vast, more thorough, more sustainable, legally implemented invisible empire that has led to the worst case of political damage control with respect to the United States that I've ever seen in my lifetime. And the United States is in damage control right now over this program. That's why you're not hearing anything about it. There's nothing in the mass media about it. There are no debates on the Senate floor about it. There are no pastors preaching this message from the pulpit. There are no newspapers carrying the story. No one's talking about it at all because it is a monumental embarrassment of untold proportions. Why is it a national embarrassment? Well, it's a national embarrassment. It's a national travesty because it nullifies, voids, and ignores every constitutional right and precept that exists in any political document that was ever drafted in this country. And not just the federal Constitution, but the constitutions of all 50 states have been criminally and negligently ignored by the intelligence apparatus, by the national security apparatus in this country, and it hurts me to say it. You know, I want to like the national security apparatus and intelligence apparatus in this country. I think they've done some really neat things over the years with respect to the apprehension of fugitives, the apprehension of violent criminals, the apprehension of sex offenders, and the apprehension of terrorists. But ultimately, this program, okay, our national security apparatus, our intelligence apparatus are easily corrupted. And you can always tell the quality of a governmental system by how its plainclothes representatives conduct themselves. How do U.S. politicians conduct themselves? They conduct themselves with class. They conduct themselves with fortitude. They conduct themselves with intelligence. They conduct themselves with professionalism. And they conduct themselves with integrity, mostly. There's always the exception to the rule. There's always the corrupt politician that comes around. There's always the corrupt general that comes around. There's always the corrupt governmental official or so forth that comes around. They're usually caught, but they exist. Government is corruptible. People are corruptible. So that's why the framers of the United States Constitution put stipulations in the Constitution to shield its citizenry from government corruption. Why? Because that's not what the American government, its precepts, its values are about. It's about giving people the opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and happiness with a reasonable expectation of safety, so long as you abide by the law and pay your taxes. That's it. Quite frankly, I don't need state-sanctioned undercover operatives getting in my way and pestering me on a daily basis. Okay, I can't say it enough times. The operatives that I encounter in South Florida act like zoo animals, and that's a shame because I want to like them too. I want to believe in the work that they do, but they make it hard to believe in the work that they do because are you going to have a positive image of a person or a group of people that walk around in plain clothes under the authority of the state and pester people to no end? Would you have a positive image of wards of the state who walk around in plain clothes, who use a state-sanctioned signaling mechanism to go back and forth from person to person to person, looking to start problems and instigations? Would you have a positive image of a person who is a ward of the state or an employee of the state? Or even if it's a private employee of some company or corporation or a semi-law enforcement agency who goes around in plain clothes, not upholding the Constitution, not upholding state constitutions, not upholding a concept of ethics or integrity, but rather looking to make his life more interesting by walking around in a hat and sunglasses, finding people to pester so that the situation may escalate, so he'll have a reason to pull out his state-issued firearm and blow their head off? Okay, I understand undercover work is volatile. I understand it has risks. I understand it's dangerous at some point. But do not expect from me, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, to tolerate you or put up with any more crap from you than I have to, simply because your job is stressful or dangerous or perilous. You went into that job as an undercover yourself. knowing what the dangers were. So now that you're faced with those dangers, don't get stressed out and try to take your bad day out on myself. Because I'll call you a zoo animal right to your face and walk off and do a video talking about my experience with you. You know, a lot of you spend too much time trying to pester sovereign citizens that don't have anything to do with the real problems. You know, are you guys investigating human trafficking? Are you guys investigating child abuse? Are you investigating terrorism? Just what the hell are you investigating? And why are you coming around me so often with these units of thuggish, animalistic type undercovers that don't do anything positive or constructive? Rather, they just go from place to place, following signal to signal, enjoying the weather down here, I guess, pissing people off and pestering them in ways that some might find menacing, harassing, or intimidating. I'd kind of like to see a statistic that shows how many undercover operatives wind up in the hospital or dead because they attacked the wrong person or pissed off the wrong person or just wouldn't go the hell away when somebody asked them to. I imagine that number's pretty high, actually, and it's probably hidden. Okay, what is an invisible empire? Well, the Ku Klux Klan operated by a code of secrecy. They recruited their members in secret rites. Their methods and ways and objectives were oftentimes hidden from the general public. Most people viewed them as a semi-law enforcement body, actually, in the 1920s that you could go to if you had a problem or an issue or a matter of concern that you wanted handled in a certain kind of way, as opposed to going to the local police or handling the problem yourself, or perhaps getting some people that you knew personally to maybe approach the matter with you in a cohesive fashion and find a solution to the problem that way. There are some people who would rather go and obtain the services of the Klan, possibly for a fee, possibly in exchange for a favor, and solve their problem that way. It was called the Invisible Empire because there were scores of American citizens participating in this entity. And ultimately, the entity itself started becoming known for committing what the FBI has referred to all these years later as terrorist activity against freedmen, against their supporters, against other ethnic minorities that they didn't believe were innately clean or virtuous. Do I believe that elements of this group that still exists today, just not in the same capacity, has permeated the gang stalking mechanism? Yes, it has. It would be nearly impossible to assert otherwise, because keep in mind, gang stalking is the progeny or the offspring of FBI COINTELPRO Operation Hoodwink. So because this program was aimed at dismantling the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Panther Party, and the American Communist Party through disruption, subversion, attack, and harassment mechanisms to its members, using their communities as essentially weapons against them, then of course modern day gang stalking, which is essentially COINTELPRO Part 2, has to pull from those experiences, from those blueprints, from those innovations in intelligence and personnel mobilization. There's no way to divorce the two, okay? There are elements of clandestine gang stalking that pull from the kinds of protocols and mechanisms that were used against the Black Panthers, against the Ku Klux Klan, and against the American Communist Party. Those methods are still being used. They've just been beefed up because we have exponentially more technology in today's world than we did in the 1960s. Okay, so call it COINTELPRO Operation Hoodwink on steroids. How does it create an empire? Well, in order to create an empire, you need a governmental structure, you need a military, you need a financial system, and you need a population that is subject to your empire. How can clandestine gang stalking be called an invisible empire? Because it has all of the above. It's state sanctioned. It pulls its financial resources from the national security legislation that was passed post 9/11. It has operatives all across the country that work in a official capacity. And it has an army, okay? The stalkers themselves, they're the army. The signal takers, the signal givers, the ones that use the verbal commands and the vehicular maneuvers to communicate with one another clandestinely. That's the army, okay? And the subjects are simply the American people. Anyone who is a sovereign citizen of this country is a subject to the invisible empire. And they don't know that they're included in such a designation. They just see themselves as everyday U.S. citizens. They get up, they go to work, they come home, and then the next day they do the same thing all over again. Some have wives, some have husbands, some have children, some have educations, and some don't. Some make six figures, some don't. Some drive, some ride the bus. Some are on the path to retirement, some are not. Some have criminal records, some are upstanding citizens. Some are Republicans, some are Democrats, some are independent, some are unaffiliated. But ultimately, the United States population are the subjects, or the citizenry, or the constituents of this invisible empire, this shadow government, this deep state that we call the gang stalking mechanism. Okay, this thing is no longer obscure. Okay, at first it presented itself as simply a way of pestering people who may have teed off the wrong person. But now we see it's something much more. It's a social engineering product. It's a paramilitary product. It's a community policing product. It's a special operations product. And all of these things cost the taxpayer money. That's why I say this program needs to be made public, and made public right this minute. Okay? It's obvious that this product feeds from the military-industrial complex, which draws $2 trillion a year at the taxpayer's expense so that it can buy the kinds of sophisticated weapons technology that it takes to prosecute clandestine gang stalking campaigns. Anything that requires taxpayer money ought to be made public. Anything that requires taxpayer complacency needs to be made public. Anything that could threaten the constitutional precept of no taxation without representation needs to be made public. If it's not made public, then it's not legitimate as a program. Would you sign a mortgage without reading the contract? Would you sign a car loan without reading the contract? Would you sign a movie deal or a record deal or a contract to go into a new place of employment without reading the contract? Would you take out a credit card without reading the contract first? We have contracts for a reason. It's to protect the business and it's to protect the consumer. Contracts ensure that a business can go into a payment arrangement with a consumer with a reasonable expectation of getting their money. If not, then various legal actions can be taken based upon the amount of the loan. Contracts also protect the consumer because it gives them an opportunity to go into an agreement with a business with their eyes wide open in such a way so as to ensure that they're getting the best quality product they could possibly get for the fairest price, and with reasonable expectation of getting what they paid for. The political philosopher Thomas Hobbes said in the 18th century, if I'm not mistaken, that when a person is born into this country, they go into a social contract with the United States federal government. Now, this is an unwritten contract. It's not as if every child that's born into this world has parents to sign a contract that has stipulations as to how this child should be raised or how this child should be taught or the kinds of political ideas that this child should have throughout their life. A social contract is an unwritten contract. If you're born into this country, if you have a social security number, if you're able to use public resources, then you go into a social contract with your government that says, look, everything you see in this country is yours. There's nothing in this country you cannot do. You can take advantage of every public resource that exists here. But there's a stipulation. You have to pay your taxes and you have to obey the law. If you do those things, anything in this country can be yours. But most Americans don't know about that social contract, but you are in a social contract. And that social contract permeates your flesh and blood. It goes beyond your name. It goes beyond your social security number. It goes beyond who your parents are. It goes beyond the community you're born in. It goes beyond your race. It goes beyond your gender. It goes beyond your very soul. The social contract you go into with this country when you're born into it, or when you become a permanent citizen here, if you're an immigrant, that contract is not breakable so long as you're an American citizen. If you want to dwell in this country, whether you're born here or not, there are regulations and statutes that must be followed if you are to have a prosperous and progressive existence here in this country. Okay? Now, having said that, we must talk about some of the more intricate aspects of clandestine gang stalking and why it is a total nullification not only of your constitutional rights, not only of your state rights, not only of your civil rights, not only of your civil freedoms, not only of your inalienable rights, but it's a violation of you as a living, breathing, free-thinking person. Now, me personally, I've been doing this program for 10 years. And I have thousands of videos up on the internet talking about various political matters, particularly those matters that pertain to clandestine gang stalking, ladies and gentlemen. Audacity is an important concept here. At what point does the state overstep its boundary? At what point does the state intrude too far, too deeply, too quickly? At what point does the state need to stop and say, you know what? I think we're going to have to reprogram some things so that they work properly. In my lecture called The Perception Filter, I talk about the ways that accountability is dodged with respect to covert operations. Okay? Covert operations, particularly those of a national security sort, has a gray area with respect to its ethical application. There is a moral gray area when you're talking about covert operations, when you're talking about national security. You cannot expect every national security officer, every SWAT team officer, every law enforcement officer, any military soldier that exists in the world today to conduct themselves on a daily basis like Mr. Rogers would, or Big Bird, or Barney the Dinosaur, or some big softy. If you're gonna serve and protect, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level, you have to have an edge to you, and you have to know how to get things done. That's why law enforcers, whether they're plainclothes or not, are seen as assets to their department because, as the old saying goes, good help is hard to find. But here's the discipline to this invisible empire conversation that we're having. You're gonna have to, if you're going to use the national security mechanism or the intelligence apparatus in this country in a way where actual U.S. citizens can be targeted, not only by their fellow citizens, but by wards of the state, particularly in an undercover capacity, you are going to have to come with some sort of a legal justification for that the American people can observe. Why? Because it's my tax dollars and the tax dollars of others that uphold this country. It's my tax dollars that build roads, bridges, public schools, public works, public programs, law enforcement, state and local military apparatus. It's money that comes from the taxpayer that makes all that possible. So, if you're going to use covert operations on those same taxpayers, the taxpayer has a right to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, And what's the result going to be? Because a contract is a two-way street. If I go into a social contract with the United States federal government the day that I'm born, that contract is twofold. I have obligations to the state, but the state also has obligations to me. If those obligations are met on both ends, then America can become that shining city on a hill. But if those conditions are not met on both ends, what you're going to have is a national security mechanism posing as a government that actually uses domestic terrorism to keep its citizens in line. And that's exactly what assert clandestine gang stalking is, ladies and gentlemen. It is state-sanctioned domestic terrorism. Citizens from all across this country have vehicles that are being used against them as weapons by the state, by liaisons, and by signalers as a part of this mechanism that no congressman, no senator, no president, no governor, no politician at all has issued a public opinion about. So the void that they have essentially created with their complacency, I'm filling that void with my lectures that I do on a daily basis. My company, EIS Media Group and Bible Discourses LLC, are the authority on this matter. And what I do is a public service. You can tune in to me on any of my websites, YouTube, Google, Facebook, Instagram, and hear the truth of truths about the U.S. federal establishment for free. If you had have asked me 20 years ago, what do you think about the United States? I'd say it's a beautiful country, it's a safe country, it's a Christian country, it's a constitutional republic. What's not to like? If you had to ask me that at the age of 20, I'd tell you, I'm happy to be a United States citizen. I feel lucky to be a United States citizen. If you had to ask me that same question at the age of 30, now I'm telling you, you know what, I think I want to go the hell to Vietnam and live. And apparently I'm expendable. Apparently my trajectory through time and space is of little to no value to the intelligence or national security establishment here in the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen. I'm a sportsman. I enjoy a good contest. And that's how I approached clandestine gang stalking for a while. I approached it as a game that I could win. Perhaps a football game or a baseball game or a game of chess that had an identifiable winner and an identifiable loser. But it doesn't. Its goal is to simply cause as much damage in a covert fashion using state resources to a targeted individual over the course of their lifetime as it possibly can. With the expectation that data will be collected, that objectives will be met, that human behavior will be more accurately determined and easier to document. And hopefully it allows the U.S. federal establishment to gather data on better ways to police this country in a manner that is more easily and readily identifiable by the U.S. citizens that abide here. This is a country of, by, and for the people, not of, by, and for the military-industrial complex. All right, I imagine if there were a war today, which I don't think there will be, that everyone involved would appreciate the work of the soldiers that go into that war on the side of the United States. But the same military-industrial complex that supplies the U.S. Armed Forces with the weapons and technology they need to prosecute wars against threats, foreign and domestic, supplies the national security apparatus in this country and the intelligence apparatus with this country with the resources they need to walk around in plain clothes and pester the hell out of whoever they want to. Maybe being in plain clothes and being a ward of the state makes you feel special and like you're above the law, you're above the Constitution, you're above the Bill of Rights because you make 5 figures every year to put on a hat and sunglasses and go out into the world acting as if you're doing some sort of a service to this country, when really all you're doing is pestering people on a daily basis. You know, I would like to see clandestine gang stalking treated with the same respect that the U.S. ambassador of the United States treated the Cuban situation with this week with. The U.S. ambassador of the United States to the United Nations went to the United Nations this week and got up in front of 100 other countries' representatives and said, we have knowledge and intel of Cuba being a state sponsor of terrorism, a state sponsor of human trafficking, and a state sponsor of cartel activity. That was said by a United States ambassador this week to the United Nations about Cuba. He said it's 90 miles off the coast of the United States. And we have reason to believe that it uses terrorist networks in the United States as an asset to the Cuban government. A U.S. ambassador said that this week. That is something that should be in all the newspapers. That is something that should be on every headline. That is something that should be in every news forum in the country because of its significance. Okay? If we have a country just 90 miles away that is a state sponsor of terrorism, we need to know about it. Now, treat gang stalking with that same caution. Have the U.S. ambassador go to the United Nations and say, we are in receipt of documents and intelligence that there exists in the United States a program of a covert nature that covertly surveils and disrupts sovereign U.S. citizens with no particular cause other than to collect data on human behavior, as well as essentially using that targeted person as a guinea pig for various covert operational procedures. Have that same United Nations ambassador go back to the United Nations and talk about clandestine gang stalking with that same candor that it talked about when it said that the government of Cuba is actively involved in acts that are tantamount to state-sanctioned terrorism. All right, and you undercovers that followed me here, the ones that are going to follow me out, you guys are coming off as real gelatin to me. It looks like you just hang out in the background, signal people to come pester me, and look for stuff to get scared about. Well, we think he threatened me. We think he's attempting to intimidate me. We think he's attempting to instill a sense of fear in us. I think he's threatening violence right now. Let's go get the biggest, surliest, nasty, most violent thugs we can and signal him to his location as a warning. Or maybe we'll stand up in a high-rise somewhere and point some sort of a high-powered ballistic weapon at him through a scope, so we can remind ourselves how much control we have over this man's very life. I consider a hero to be a person that does a good deed for a good cause. I do not consider a hero to be a person that hides in the shadows, signals stalkers to somebody's location, looks for reasons to constantly get afraid or scared or feel threatened about something, and turn around and use that fear as justification to try and perpetrate acts of violence against your target. I am of the mindset, quite frankly, I don't care what part of the world we're in. We could be in South Florida, we could be in Texas, we could be in Arizona, we could be in New York City, we can be in Baltimore, Maryland, we can be in Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Des Moines, Iowa, Salt Lake City, Utah, Mount Pelier, Vermont, Knoxville, Tennessee, Montgomery, Alabama, Biloxi, Mississippi. We could be in Delaware. We could be in Massachusetts. We can be in Washington. We could be anywhere in the country. We're still in the United States. I don't care what the demographic is. And it looks to me like a lot of the undercovers here in South Florida have gotten real comfortable because they're around compatriots. So you feel like you can use your powers as a ward of the state to pester whom you will, so long as they speak a different language than you do. I don't call that heroism, I call that cowardice. And quite frankly, the undercover operatives that I've been seeing, the ones that like to roll past you on bicycles, okay, the ones that like to walk past you arbitrarily and use disgusting gestures to either get your attention or get rid of you. I'm telling you right the hell now, I invoke my First Amendment right to the U.S. Constitution to say what I say. I invoke those same rights to run my business any way I choose to. And I invoke those same rights to explain my position on any number of political issues. If you all don't like it, show me your credentials as wards of the state. Show me your objectives. Show me your mission statements. And essentially just take off your hat and sunglasses and retire, because I have no need for you. But if you don't show me your credentials, I'm just going to consider you hostile enemy belligerents. Just like the United States is getting ready to do to Cuba. The United States is getting ready to declare Cuba a hostile enemy belligerent and a state sponsor of terrorism. Okay, that's the reality of the matter. Does the Cuban government have operations here in the United States that I should know about? Okay, I'm not afraid of no punk, I'm not afraid of no thug, and I'm not afraid of no damn terrorist. I'm not afraid of some zoo animal acting undercover operative either. As a matter of fact, I feel sorry for the people that have to pay your salaries. I consider you a liability to the United States and not an asset. And quite frankly, this street theater mechanism that I'm seeing in clandestine gang stalking is thuggish and pathetic. Quite frankly, I don't think none of you are man enough to sit down across a table from me and speak about these issues intelligently. Rather, you'd rather signal some thug to my exact location and use some pestering act to make your point. That ain't how men come to resolutions. That ain't how children come to resolutions. As far as I'm concerned, there are farm animals that can show more intelligence with respect to compromise and resolution than a lot of these federal liaisons and these wards of the state that walk around in plain clothes, conducting themselves like animals, are doing to various citizens across this country in an extrajudicial process. That's right. Use your disgusting bodily functions and gestures as a show of disdain for the truth. Don't try to argue these matters. Don't try to debate them. As a matter of fact, don't even try. What's the point? If you don't see what's happening and you can't learn what's happening, then you're going to handle your problems in your own way. That doesn't mean you're going to win. That doesn't mean you're going to come out ahead. It just means that you are a person that's going to allow yourself to be labeled as a useful idiot, somebody who other people can take advantage of easily, somebody that follows direction rather than think for yourself. You see a signal, you hear a verbal command, you see a vehicular maneuver, and you follow it obediently, regardless of what the effect of your actions is going to have on the next person or society. See, that's why they call you gang stalkers. Okay, because you move in units, you follow targets, and you oftentimes use violence in your operation. Okay? Some people call it gang stalking. I call it domestic terrorism. And quite frankly, if the federal establishment of this country wants to drag its feet, then people like me will have to continue doing what I do. And quite frankly, if gang stalking were to be repealed tonight on the Senate floor of Congress, I, your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, would still do videos about the political situation of this country, and I would leave all of my work up. As a relic for people to see what happens when a federal establishment, a federal government, a state government, a local government decides to neglect the will of the people and the United States Constitution. Thank you for listening.